Good evening and welcome to tonight's public meeting of the 2019 New York City Charter Revision Commission. I'm Gail Benjamin, the chair of the commission, and I am joined by the following members. To my left is Dr. Merrill Tisch, Mr. Satish Nuri, Reverend Clinton Miller, Sal Albanese, former council member, Steve Fiella, former council member, and to my right is my counsel, Janita John. I don't know why I said James John. They're all books. Jim Karras, Lisette Camillo, commissioner, and below her is Carl Weisbrod, Paula Gavin, Dr. Lillian Barrios Paoli, and Allison Hirsch. Do you want to join them on that side? Yeah, there's an extra seat there. Allison is on the move. Okay. Before we begin, I will entertain a motion to adopt the minutes of the Commission's meeting on February 25th at City Hall, a copy of which has been provided to all of the commissioners. Do I hear a motion? Second? All those in favor? Opposed? The motion carries. Today we will continue the Commission's series of expert forums on the focus areas we adopted in January. This evening we are privileged to be joined by a distinguished set of panelists put together in consultation with my fellow commissioners who have generously agreed to speak to us about the extremely important topic of police accountability. New York, like many cities, has a long history of grappling with how best to ensure effective oversight over law enforcement agencies and officers who wield immense power in order to do the vital job of keeping the city and its citizens safe. The Commission has received many proposals for reforming and strengthening the police accountability and disciplinary system, many centered on the rules of the Civilian Complaint Review Board and, of course, the police commissioner himself. We very much look forward to delving into these important panelists with our topic. I would like to make a few announcements just for the audience, which I see is very full. One is, I know you're aware this is a public meeting, not a public hearing, so you will not be able to speak. Our forum is that each one of our panelists will have 3 minutes to make a statement, and then the commissioners will question them for approximately half an hour. Then we have several more panelists and panels. The rules of the chamber, I noticed that many of you have signs, and I know that the Sergeant-at-Arms have told you that the signs are fine as long as they're on your lap, but not above your head. This one would interfere with the live stream and the cameras, and two is just kind of a little hard for other people in back of you to see, and I'd like to make sure, as I have at all the meetings, that the hearing is a courteous one. In that regard, I would ask that all of us refrain from clapping, booing, or otherwise expressing satisfaction, dissatisfaction with the speaker, the question, and allow the panels to speak without interruption. If you have comments, we're happy to take them afterwards in writing, or if you want to speak to a staff member and give them comments or questions or other things, we're happy to take that. We also have our site online. You can tweet at us, and there are various ways you can communicate with us. Last but not least, if you feel that you really want to indicate your support of something and you feel that you must let us know, we prefer jazz hands. With that being said, let's get started with our first panel. Each panelist will have 3 minutes to introduce themselves and provide brief opening remarks. Then we'll have 30 minutes for commissioner questions. If 30 minutes ends up not being enough time to get to your question, let me or staff know and we'll arrange for follow-up. For brevity's sake, I'm going to call up the panelists and I'll ask that each of them introduce themselves briefly in their statements. On this first panel, we have Rachel Bloom. Do you want to just raise your hand? Thank you. Ethan Geringer Samuth. Jo Hyung Kang. Have I pronounced that or mangled? Okay. Pamela Monroe and Michael Sizitsky. It is now all yours. Ms. Bloom, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. Good evening, Chair Benjamin and distinguished members of the New York City Charter Revision Commission. My name is Rachel Bloom, and I am the Director of Public Policy and Programs at Citizens Union. Thank you for holding this forum and inviting us here to publicly share our recommendations with you. As a watchdog group for the public interest and a historic advocate in open and honest government here in New York City, we urge amendments to the city charter tonight that will strengthen the accountability of the New York City Police Department to the public and consequently improve the relationships between the NYPD and the public. Since 2008, we have been exploring the issue of police accountability with particular emphasis on establishing clarity and consistency across the police oversight system and strengthening the Civilian Complaint Review Board to bolster independent oversight of the police. The following are our recommendations for charter reform, which we believe are urgent and should be taken up by this revision commission. These changes, if adopted, would amend Section 440 of Chapter 18A of the New York City Charter. 1, codify the CCRB's power to file and handle the prosecution of complaints it substantiates with the recommendations of charges and specifications instead of NYPD lawyers from the Department Advocate's Office. The CCRB should be given full authority and responsibility in the law for developing its own team of qualified and experienced lawyers to litigate the substantiated cases. A 2012 Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, between the NYPD and the CCRB gave the CCRB this authority by establishing an administrative prosecution process, but this does not have the force of law, and the extent to which certain features of the MOU are being followed is questionable. 2, require the police commissioner to provide the CCRB and respondent the rationale when diverging from CCRB disciplinary recommendations. The 2012 MOU requires the police commissioner notify the CCRB in writing with a detailed explanation for the reasons for deviating from their recommendation. Citizens Union was involved in the negotiation of this MOU and believes this requirement would provide an appropriate and meaningful expansion of the CCRB's independent oversight. 3, amend the charter to permit the CCRB to initiate an investigation into reported or known incidents of police misconduct within its jurisdiction in the absence of a complaint. With this authority, the CCRB would no longer be forced to remain on the sidelines when there is a notorious or sensitive incident that has become the focus of community and police concern. I'm going to run through them now. 4, empower the CCRB to investigate complaints by the public against members of the police department's school safety division, a unit of public safety officers under the supervision of the police department, as well as other divisions overseen and controlled by the police department. 5, safeguard the independence and integrity of CCRB investigations and standardize the effects of participation in an investigation for complaints, witnesses, and officers. And finally, we would just recommend that for greater transparency in the budget of city agencies, including the NYPD, before being voted on by the council. To that end, the words program, purpose, activity, and institution need to be defined in the charter, chapter 6, section 100, in relation to units of appropriation, so that units of appropriation will be made more narrow and finite, rather continue as a catch-all categories reflecting numerous programs or an entire agency's budget. Thank you very much for having us here tonight to talk about this issue.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kang. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Dry.
Can I just do one thing? Yep. Hold on one second. We've just been joined by Commissioner Cordero.
Great. Thank you, Commissioners, for inviting Communities United for Police Reform to testify tonight. My name is Ju-Hyun Kang, representing our campaign, which is, for those of you who don't know, a campaign that runs coalitions of up to 200 organizations that are national and local around police accountability. Our work on police accountability and transparency over the past few years has resulted in landmark legislation by the City Council, including the Community Safety Act, the Right to Know Act. We were also able to coordinate a campaign to have Governor Cuomo do an executive order for a special prosecutor for all police killings in the state of New York. The commission for tonight, we have 7 recommendations in 2 areas that we'd like to share, specifically around changes to the charter that we think would advance police accountability and transparency. We'll be submitting written testimony separately. But I did want to start by saying that these 7 recommendations are really based on the experience of our member organizations and CPR as a whole over the past number of years, but even preceding CPR over the past several decades, working with families, including the families of Marley Graham, Eric Garner, Delron Small, Saeed Vassal, Anthony Baez, Amadou Diallo, etc., but also the experiences of our members whose names are not known and who face daily humiliation in communities that are over-policed or abuse that goes hidden and not reported, or reported and not acted upon. The 2 areas that we have recommendations are, one, around the absolute systemic crisis that there is right now of lack of any kind of meaningful, timely, or transparent discipline when officers cause harm to members of the public. And by harm, we include the entire scale, including from the most egregious cases as revealed by BuzzFeed, of hundreds of officers who are still on the force today, even though they have been found guilty by the department of excessive force, sexual misconduct, and lying in official capacities. The second area is around lack of transparency and lack of meaningful oversight of major NYPD expenditures. But on the first category of lack of timely, transparent, and meaningful discipline, there are 4 recommendations that we have in terms of changes to the charter. One is that the police commissioner should not have exclusive authority for all disciplinary cases. We would recommend that one of the charter revisions that the commission takes up be that the CCRB be enabled to determine discipline in cases that the Administrative Prosecution Unit prosecutes. Secondly is to expand the CCRB's authority to be able to prosecute related misconduct. So that includes cases where someone has been an officer was caught lying, or other kinds of misconduct that the CCRB certainly currently cannot prosecute on. And so they split cases and send those examples to the IAB, which almost never gets acted upon. Third is to expand the CCRB's authority to include school safety agents as well as peace officers, as we saw most recently in the case of Jasmine Headley being brutalized by officers. It's incredibly important to have some kind of oversight. Third is to expand fourth is to, when the commissioner deviates from CCRB findings and discipline, the reasons should be made public. And then the other 3 recommendations are around the oversight of NYPD expenditures. I don't want to take too much time, so I'm happy to go through them during questions. Or do you want me to just run through them right now?
Just do them really quick.
I'll do them really quick. One is to amend the procurement process. So in December, the NYPD purchased its first set of drones. There was no public oversight process for that, and unlike other municipalities around the country, there is no ability for the public to require transparency or even to be able to veto those kinds of expenditures around surveillance technologies. Second is to require NYPD reporting of private income and expenses, where some surveillance and other types of purchases are made, and there is no public oversight even from the council that's enabled by that. And third is similar to what Citizens Union said, which is to make sure that there are detailed units of appropriation within the budget so that the NYPD's full budget is transparent to the public and to the City Council and to legislators. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Pamela Moore.
Monroe.
Monroe, I'm sorry.
Good evening. My name is Pamela Monroe, and I represent the campaign for an elected civilian review board. We are a coalition of over 44 organizations and prominent individuals. Over the past 3 years, we have talked to thousands of New Yorkers about replacing the current appointed review board with an elected board. Our idea is met with nearly universal support wherever we go. As of this afternoon, we have thousands of signatures on our petition, and we have collected more this evening. One day, while canvassing in Brooklyn, we met a young black mother who told us she has arranged her work schedule morning and afternoon to walk her kids to and from school. This wasn't to protect them from gangs or criminals. She said this was to protect them from the NYPD. That is why we are here tonight, for New Yorkers who are afraid of the police. And we have good reason to be afraid. Over the last 4 years, over 17,900 civilian complaints were made to the CCRB. As a result, 0 officers have been fired. But in the past 5 years, our city has paid out $384 million taxpayer dollars in civil judgments. So clearly, misconduct is occurring. In fact, New Yorkers are being harassed, injured, and killed, while our city's response is just to wait for the lawsuits. At their faces, you will see the real human cost is reflected in the portraits of our neighbors killed by the NYPD. We propose a new system of police accountability and discipline, one that is in the hands of the people. We propose a board of 21 members elected by their neighbors, responsible to their district and answerable to New Yorkers. Police discipline has been for too long tied up in an appointed board, and by now we think it's safe to say that the CCRB has failed. Our elected board would put the needs, experience, and values of the community to work, holding the police accountable to the same standards that apply to every resident. Our elected board would have binding disciplinary power. Our elected board can change the fabric of New York. Public outcry around Rodney King gave rise to the appointed review boards of the 90s. The modern Black Lives Matter movement demands elected civilian review boards now. Let's talk about being first to do the right thing. Let's bring an elected civilian review board to voters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you could now up. Excuse me, I had asked, as a matter of courtesy, if we would not applaud or boo, if we would just either use jazz hands to indicate that we're in favor of what a speaker is saying, but I would really appreciate your assistance in this. Please, please, please. The next speaker is Ethan Geringer-Samuth.
Ethan is just, he's my colleague. We're one testimony together.
Then we have Michael Sisitsky.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Michael Sisitsky. I'm lead policy counsel with the New York Civil Liberties Union. I'll also flag that we are also members of Communities United for Police Reform. We support all of the recommendations that Ju-Yeon mentioned in her testimony, and I want to expand on the pieces about what the city charter could be amended to better reflect greater accountability for police discipline, as well as greater oversight in the procurement of surveillance technology by the NYPD. Local and independent civilian oversight is a necessary component for fair and accountable policing. The NYCLU has been instrumental in trying to ensure that there are such systems in place in New York City. We were instrumental in the creation of the CCRB and have worked to ensure that it has what it needs to live up to its charter mandate. But the biggest problem has always been in the lack of the CCRB's authority. While the CCRB has the authority to investigate and in some cases prosecute cases of police misconduct, its recommendations on disciplinary outcomes are not binding on the NYPD. And the police commissioner has exclusive authority in the city charter, section 434, to decide and impose disciplinary outcomes in all cases. And in practice, the exercise of this authority has been really cause for alarm. In 2017, the police commissioner imposed penalties weaker than those recommended by the CCRB in the overwhelming majority of cases. And in the most serious cases of officer misconduct that were substantiated by the CCRB and that went to full departmental trials within the NYPD, the police commissioner imposed discipline consistent with CCRB recommendations in just 27% of cases. And this low rate of concurrence is not unique to any one police commissioner. It's been persistent throughout different mayoral administrations, throughout different police commissioners. It has been a consistent pattern of the NYPD flagrantly disregarding CCRB recommendations. In the past, the NYCLU has called on the city to remove the police commissioner's exclusive authority to decide disciplinary outcomes, and we reiterate that call tonight. The NYPD has proven time and time again its willingness to ignore calls for outside oversight and its unwillingness to hold itself to the high standards that we expect of our police force. Civilian oversight of policing is an empty exercise if the police commissioner can just disregard the recommendations of an oversight agency. So we would recommend that the commission look at either removing, transferring that authority outright outside the NYPD, or in some way cabining that exercise of discretion to prevent the kind of abuses that we've been seeing. And lastly, on the piece of regarding surveillance technologies, the problem that we see with police abuse of communities of color is that it often happens in secret because the tools that the NYPD uses to target and harass communities of color are acquired in secret. Unlike places like Seattle, Oakland, Cambridge, Massachusetts, those places require, anytime the police department seeks to acquire new surveillance tools, it disclose that planned acquisition to the city council, propose their planned policies, how they intend to use the technologies, whether they're going to share the information gathered by those technologies with other agencies, including potentially federal immigration enforcement agencies, and then give the public an opportunity to comment on, testify as to whether or not they want that technology acquired in the first place, and give those local councils the ability to veto technology acquisition if they find that the risks to privacy and civil liberties are not worth the risk. So we would recommend that the commission look at amending the charter to require that the NYPD seek council approval anytime they seek to acquire new surveillance tools and technologies. We have more information in our written testimony and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, commissioners? Commissioner Hirsch?
I have two questions. One is for either Rachel or Jiyang. What is the current procedure for discipline of school safety officers?
There's not really a good procedure. Oftentimes those complaints actually end up going to IAB, the Internal Affairs Bureau of the NYPD, which, as we all know, actually doesn't act upon complaints with the seriousness that we need in New York. And so an example of that is that there have been hundreds of racial profiling complaints of officers, not only in terms of school safety agents, but NYPD officers. And the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau has not substantiated one of them. This is after the stop and frisk federal lawsuit, the Floyd lawsuit. So we don't really have any kind of faith that when serious allegations go to the IAB that they will be acted upon. And it's one of the reasons why it's been important that the CCRB is now also investigating sexual misconduct complaints.
Thanks.
And I would just add that it's extremely important when we're thinking about, the youngest people, to have a very clear system for how they can file a complaint by a school officer. It's we've got to think about access as well for those students in New York.
And my second question is for Ms. Monroe. I understand the goal of the elected CCRB is to reform the system and ensure its accountability, but can you explain why you think elections are necessary to do that? And are you at all concerned that organizations like the PBA could put a tremendous amount of resources and sort of shift the electorate in a way that the CCRB could actually be less transparent and worse than it is now through the election process?
Sure. First and foremost, we believe that an elected board is the way to go because it stands on the tenet of the democratic tenet that citizens in this country deserve the right or have the right to have equal say in issues that affect them. So we believe that current appointed systems are biased, towards the politicians that appoint them. So this would allow the people to have a say, which is a democratic tenet, and an elected board would represent not just one person elected or appointed from each borough, but actually all of the neighborhoods in the city. So there would be greater representation of our diverse city. So there would be 21 members versus the 13. And again, they would not be one person from each borough. There'd be 21 members from the different districts. There's so many reasons why we think an elected board would be the way to go. We don't currently have an elected board, but that doesn't mean that there aren't strides being made in this country for elected, or in part or in whole. Our sister city, Rochester, New York, has put through proposals to amend the current board to that of an elected board. Chicago is doing the same. New York City has the largest police force. The New Yorkers deserve to have the people represent them. I don't understand. Well, I'll keep my personal opinions to myself. It allows basically the people who have been abused a say. So it's the NYPD is the police department of the people. Is it not? Is the taxpayers? They should report to the people. Yeah.
Mr. Karras?
I'd like to pose Commissioner Hirsch's last question to the New York Civil Liberties Union and the Citizens Union. What their views on an elected board would be, especially, my concern would be, in times of increasing crime, you might get a very different civilian complaint review board than in times of low crime. And also, if you have any comments on any changes that your organizations think might be salutary for the composition of the board.
Citizens Union hasn't considered or taken a formal position on the issue of an elected review board, but we do believe that the amendments that we've outlined in our testimony are necessary steps to improving the accountability of the police department, and yes. We would like to see those tested before. I don't know necessarily if we would like to see them tested before considering something as radical as electing a review board, but these should be considered as part of that conversation as well.
Can I didn't answer Commissioner Hirsch's question about special interests. She asked me, what did I think about the PBA maybe sending people? It's true that in a democratic society, we have elections, and elections are a process whereby the people choose the most qualified candidates. So anyone would have to run on a campaign, and their campaign would expose their qualifications and expose their opinions and expose their interests. When you're looking at the whole city voting and you're looking at candidates from all of the neighborhoods, not just a borough, but all of the neighborhoods, yes, you may have people from Staten Island who may, want to see the police have a free pass. But on a board with 21 members, it's not about the one person. It's about all these people from all these other neighborhoods who were affected by this crisis.
Thank you very much.
And Commissioner, to answer your question, the NYCLU has also taken no position on an elected civilian review board. Our view has been that the central crisis facing police accountability has been the lack of authority for an outside independent oversight agency. But that said, I do think we are all in agreement with a shared goal of trying to find ways that the Charter can ensure that these decisions are not just left up to the NYPD Commissioner.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave Ms. Kang out as well.
We're a pretty big coalition, and we're still in discussion, so we don't have a public position on this.
Okay. Commissioner Nuri?
I guess my question is, not having a position on an issue such as having an elected CCRB at this time, isn't that a position in itself? And turning it over to Ms. Monroe, what are your views on the other recommendations made by your colleagues at the table? I mean, do you support any of those recommendations? Do those recommendations satisfy some of the concerns that you're raising in support of an elected CCRB? So maybe we'd start with you guys first on your lack of a position on this issue as a position in itself. I mean, 7 recommendations, but an elected CCRB is not one of them.
Well, I'll start for Citizens Union. Our work in police accountability sort of really been focused in the last decade. We're 120 years old. It takes us a very long time to come to our policy positions. We have a very slow collaborative process. I think that when it's not that we didn't, I mean, historically, we largely usually believe that the mayor has the right to make appointments. We've supported that, not necessarily specifically about the CCRB, but in general about different roles throughout the city government. But I can honestly say it just hasn't been something as we focused on this work, our work was about sort of making the police and just more accountable and transparent. And that is sort of our approach to police accountability reform. It could be something we would look at in the future. We have not looked at it at all. That's not to say we won't in the future. We just haven't yet.
Sorry, did you want to go ahead?
For the NYCLU, we similarly have a long deliberative process internally. And again, this issue has been one where we viewed it as less a problem of where the appointments or elections come from for these members as what kind of power they are able to exercise in these matters. So that's been the main focus of our engagement with the CCRB, with NYPD discipline more broadly, is where those structural lines of authority to actually act upon disciplinary investigations and recommendations lie. And similarly, we work with a lot of community-based partners with Citizens Union, with Communities United for Police Reform, and we are engaged in these conversations, and we are trying to make sure that whatever positions that we take are reflective of where our community partners are.
And I don't know that my answer changes much beyond that we don't have a position, that we're in discussion about it. But what I would say is that the 7 recommendations that we have come directly from our membership's experience with the failures in relationship to cases. So, for example, with Eric Garner right now, which I think everyone knows about Eric Garner, it's one of the most high-profile cases in the country as well as the world. We have a situation right now where the only reason the officer who put Eric in a chokehold and killed him in front of all of us in video is even being prosecuted for disciplinary charges because the CCRB brought charges. And in fact, the NYPD blocked those charges for close to a year. It wasn't until this past summer when we were able to expose that the NYPD had been lying about why they couldn't move forward, that they finally let CCRB move forward with charges against Pantaleo. However, Eric Garner's mother has been demanding that other officers who failed to intervene, who were found to lie on official reports, who leaked sealed information, should also be facing some type of discipline. And the NYPD has refused to bring charges in any of those cases, which is part of why one of our recommendations around expanding CCRB's authority so that they can actually pursue those types of cases when it's on a case that they're already prosecuting. So they're prosecuting Pantaleo, they're prosecuting on this particular case of the killing of Eric Garner, and their hands are tied to be able to do anything about officers who lied, who covered up, and that's actually what the blue wall of silence is, right? It's not just about the brotherhood, so-called, of the NYPD, it's actually systematic historical cover-up that happens in all of the police brutality cases that we've worked on that we see routinely, where there's illegal activity, including leaking sealed information, or really brutal activity that's happening. And all to say that these recommendations are coming directly from the experience that members have had and what's been wrong in the cases to be able to see how we can actually increase accountability and transparency of the NYPD. And on the drones piece, which is not really about the ECRB recommendations or surveillance technologies, rather, we're in a moment right now where if New York City doesn't take action to try to rein in surveillance technologies, we won't be able to turn back the clock. Pandora's box will be open.
To address the question the Commissioner asked about how do we feel about the proposals that are being presented by other members of the panel, I'll read from our proposed legislation which has been submitted to you. In Section C, powers and duties of the elected civilian review board, I'll just mention that we do, our proposal is asking for an elected and empowered board. So under Section C, under powers and duties of the elected civilian review board, the ECRB shall have the power to receive, investigate, hear, make findings, and this is the amendment, take action upon complaints by members of the public. It goes on to say in that section an expansion of this jurisdiction of things that they can, and we outline all of the, including sexual misconduct, all of the allegations that they can investigate, so that's been hugely expanded. Also, within Section C, Number 5, the findings and determinations of the board and the basis therefore shall be submitted to the police commissioner for implementation, as opposed to for a recommendation being submitted. So our elected board would be empowered with the things that they suggest.
I'm sorry, are you referring to some written testimony? Because I don't seem to have it.
We've submitted it a long time ago when all of this, but I'm happy to restate. It was the last time it was sent, and it was in December when we sent research.
Okay, then it's on our website. I just thought you had something that you were presenting today and that I just somehow lost it. Councilmember Reverend Miller, and then Councilmember Albanese.
Thank you. My question is actually about the elections of an elected civilian review board. What would the elections look like? Would there be terms? How many terms? I'm assuming based on your testimony there would be absolutely no appointees. During such elections, would candidates run under a political party affiliation? I'd like to know more about that.
In the proposed legislation that we've submitted under Section B, the elected civilian review board, point number 4, the members shall be elected for a term of 4 years, coinciding with the terms of office and scheduled elections of the mayor and city council members. I don't think we specify that they have to run with a party. It might be kind of like how with the last election we just had. That's yeah. With the public advocate.
Sal?
This is for anyone on the panel. The CCRB has evolved from the time when it was basically a substrata of NYPD. Most of the officials were appointed by the police commissioner and the mayor, and a lot of them had law enforcement experience. Now, the CCRB doesn't have anyone that sits on that board that is an NYPD employee. And we also have another agency that was just created that has an additional 40 staff members independent of the NYPD in the Inspector General's office, whose focuses on police accountability. We also have a federal monitor who gets paid a lot of money to oversee the police department as part of a federal court decision. So my question is to anyone on the panel, are these things not working?
You want to start? You want me to? Sorry, we're laughing along with the audience. I hope that's okay. I think that the bigger issue, or I think what we would say within Communities United for Police Reform, is that all of the agencies and individuals that you named actually have different functions. And the CCRB, the police commissioner still appoints 3 members to the CCRB's board, as you know, so it's not as if the police commissioner has no influence right now. With the federal monitor, they have a very narrow mandate, which is only to assess compliance in relationship to the Floyd federal stop and frisk lawsuit, the Ligon lawsuit, and the Davis lawsuit in terms of policing and public housing. So it's kind of apples and oranges you're talking about. With the Inspector General, they are an agency, as you know, within DOI that was created specifically to be able to review and look at systemic issues within the NYPD and make recommendations, but those are non-binding recommendations. So we're in a situation where we've got the biggest police agency in the world and in the country that actually has unfettered power. So I don't think that saying that there are all these other agencies that have particular pieces of jobs means that there shouldn't be, that the commission shouldn't take this opportunity to put things on the ballot that will increase accountability and transparency, which we desperately need.
Have you assessed other cities, other municipalities in terms of police accountability, and what have you come up with? What is the ideal scenario that you see across the country?
I mean, I can keep talking, but go ahead.
I mean, I don't know that anywhere has actually gotten it right in terms of police accountability. We've been working with some of our local partners. It was mentioned that there's some proposals in Rochester who are now looking at kind of grappling with similar issues with a lack of accountability in their civilian review board and are looking to empower a new police accountability board with actual disciplinary authority because the current system just does not work. There's no faith in the institutions that exist to actually carry out their mandates and serve as independent checks on police abuse. So I don't know that we can point to any place that's gotten it right because I don't know that such place exists.
And we would argue that it won't get right until you allow the people to hold the police, their police departments, accountable.
Please. Sal?
On the federal monitor, as I understand it, and we have a disagreement, the federal monitor also monitors discipline, police discipline, as well as the stop and frisk issue that was raised in a court decision.
Maybe we don't disagree, and maybe it's just a matter of clarification. The federal monitor has oversight to be able to oversee compliance of reforms that are discipline related that have to do with the Floyd, Davis, or Ligon lawsuits. Not one discipline reform has been ordered, so nothing is being monitored.
And please, I would just add that what we're asking is we're asking to improve and better our system. Just because there are multiple forms of oversight in different agencies doesn't mean that is not necessarily enough if they're not working well. And so we are trying to just improve upon the CCRB and just make sure that it's more accountable and transparent and more empowered to actually act out on the things that they're putting out and on their recommendations are actually implemented.
Well, you're raising some good issues regarding procurement. That's something that should be looked at very carefully for all agencies, especially the NYPD.
Thank you. Commissioner Fiala?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Citizens Union, I took note during your testimony that you referenced the 2012 Memorandum of Understanding, and so that I'm not speaking out of turn, the exact language was the extent to which certain features of the MOU are being followed is questionable. As we try to dig into the bedrock in this subject matter, I think it'd be helpful if we could put some meat to those bones. What specifically about the existing construct, that 2012 MOU that you refer to, what's questionable about it? What areas of reform would you suggest this body consider making specifically charter related to that MOU?
What was questionable in particular is the provision in the MOU that requires the police commissioner to explain when they have diverged from a CCRB recommendation of charges and specifications. From what Citizens Union can tell, we understand that those explanations are still being delivered, but it took us an appeal of a FOIL request to find that out. So obviously there's very little transparency in the way that these explanations are being delivered, and it's impossible for us to tell whether, for instance, the police commissioner is providing such a detailed explanation with reasons, not limited to each factor that the police commissioner has considered in making that determination. So that alone we think is a problem. If the public can't tell the value of that explanation, then what value does that really have? Is it meaningful?
This is probably a question that'll have to be deferred for the CCRB, but I'll ask it of you anyway, since you seem to have a fair amount of knowledge in this area. Are you aware of any current or ongoing discussions between the CCRB and the NYPD with respect to this particular provision that you seem to say is lacking, it's deficient? It seems to me that it's kind of a loophole that wouldn't really require very much to close. Are you aware of any dialogue that presently is being undertaken to close that loophole or strengthen that provision so as to arrest the concern?
Well, currently, I think part of the wall that's being hid behind is the state law, civil rights law, section 50A, which prevents the disclosure of disciplinary records of police officers and other officers. And that is being used as, I believe, an excuse to also shield these explanations. Citizens Union foiled these written explanations and specifically asked that any identifying information of police officers or any other parties be redacted, but we were told that that couldn't be provided because it was in violation of civil rights law section 50A, and only on appeal were we given that information. So obviously, civil rights law section 50A does not actually constitute a barrier to that disclosure with the information redacted, but there are obviously still serious barriers for the public accessing that information.
Can I just add something slightly different in terms of this question, which is that our main, and I don't know that we differ, but maybe it's just a different way of saying it, our main concern with that provision is actually that when the MOU was done in 2012, former Speaker Quinn and others who executed it had the expectation that when the commissioner deviated from findings or discipline recommendations of the CCRB, that those deviations and the rationale for why it deviated would be made public. In fact, Speaker Quinn was quoted saying that in the New York Times article when the MOU first came out. So the fact that that's not public now really actually shows how the NYPD has unfortunately been allowed to create their own rules even after making agreements.
Thank you.
I had a question for the members of the panel about the public safety officers and the peace officers that work for HRA, HHC, and a number of other city agencies. What are they currently covered by? Just union agreements? How are they disciplined now?
Yeah, I'm not sure. You want to say?
It varies. So with the school safety agents, they report to IAB. There are different union rules that govern the various agencies, but where the CCRB has interpreted its own charter-given authority is just in relation to uniformed sworn members of the NYPD, which is a problem because that's not how most people actually experience an encounter with a peace officer. In the case of Jasmine Headley, to her it really didn't matter whether the officer was an HRA officer or an NYPD officer. The point was there was someone who was empowered by the state with law enforcement authority that was engaged in horrific misconduct. So the sense and expectation of New Yorkers should be that when there's any officer, police officer or peace officer, they should have some independent outside agency like the CCRB that is responsible for processing and investigating those cases. But it does right now with the current system vary based on which agency.
And I think what we would add is that it also, part of the problem is that there's a whole patchwork quilt right now where actually nobody knows who's responsible. So in a particular instance, like with Jasmine Headley, HRA, the commissioner, took action in relationship to the HRA officers. But that doesn't mean that the public would know that they could actually make a complaint to HRA about peace officers who are stationed there. And it's not clear that that would actually be how it happens. And what we hear oftentimes from members who are in homeless shelters in particular, that's another example where there's a lot of peace officers who are stationed is that they have no recourse. They feel like every time they've complained to the shelter or they try to complain anywhere else, there's no mechanism for them to be able to actually have a complaint, follow the complaint, and see what happens.
Do you think you could provide us with a list of all of the agencies that currently utilize peace officers?
We could try.
And would it be your recommendation that if they were covered by the CCRB, that their agency heads function in the same way as the PC, or would you have the PC make the determinations?
I mean, I think we would say that the CCRB should make the determination if you were asking, but I'd have to ask our members.
Okay, thank you. I think Commissioner Gavin is next.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to confirm that your recommendation is to expand the CCRB beyond the 4 current categories of complaints that they receive, and then sort of a bit more about why you're recommending that.
It's probably my fault because it went so quickly. We're not necessarily recommending an expansion beyond FATO, the force, abuse, authority, et cetera. What we are recommending is that in cases where there is a FATO complaint that is substantiated by the CCRB and that the CCRB is prosecuting that case, that if there are other misconduct found, that they should be able to prosecute on that other misconduct. And a great example, I think, is you all probably heard of James Blake, the retired tennis star who was slammed to the ground brutally in 2015. He was, the case against Officer Frascatore was investigated by the CCRB. They substantiated charges and they did a trial on the excessive force. However, what happened in addition was that Frascatore had also been guilty of not notifying his supervisor and other related misconduct. And so the NYPD ended up doing a second disciplinary trial, never told James Blake that this was happening. So he finds out from the media that there was another trial against Frascatore. To this date, even though that trial happened last year or the year before, I'm not quite sure, James still doesn't know what the outcome, what the disciplinary outcome against Officer James Frascatore was. And so it's a completely not only inefficient but very abusive system that means that you can have a complaint, you go to the agency where you think it's the oversight agency to be able to deal with it. They try to deal with what they can, but then they've got to farm out the rest of the complaint to IAB, which doesn't really end up doing much.
And did anybody else recommend expanding the CCRB?
So also because we were pressed for time, we had to rush through, but point number 5 of our testimony, safeguarding the independence and integrity of the CCRB investigations and standardizing the effects of participation, includes granting the CCRB the authority to prosecute officers who lie under oath during the course of their investigation, its investigation.
I'd like to also add that I did mention that we do expand areas of investigation that also include conducting unauthorized investigation, surveillance, infiltration, disruption of lawful political, social, economic, religious organizations or their members for their political, social, economic religious views. Also discriminating on the basis of age, sex, race, ethnicity, religion, creed, national origin, immigration status, political views, union membership, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, record of criminal conviction and incarceration. There's a lot, but yeah, we try to get it all in there.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions from the commissioners? Thank you very much for joining us and for your information. And if you would like to send us any additional information you may have or respond further to some of the questions that may have been asked, I would appreciate receiving that from you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, and we're ready for our second panel now. First, I want to thank you all for being here and sharing your perspectives with us. We will proceed in the same manner as I described the first time. This is our second panel, and we are joined by Lisa Chudhary, Cynthia Conti-Cook, Brian Kaur, and Nicholas Mitchell. Can we start with Ms. Chudhary, which I've probably pronounced incorrectly?
Hi, how are you? I'm Dr. Chowdhury. I'm an assistant professor down the street at Borough of Manhattan Community College. I teach criminal justice courses full-time, but I'm also a longtime youth advocate and community organizer. And the reason I'm here is to discuss the CCRB, obviously, but also the fact that just this week we've been covering policing. My students are here. They could attest to that. And the question I opened up the chapter was with, do you think we need the police? Simultaneous, they all said yes. Then I followed up with the question, do you trust the police? More than half said no. So here we are with where I'm teaching criminal justice students that want to one day become law enforcement officers that don't trust an institution they want to be a part of. So this is my concern. So a lot of the work that I do in the community is how can we improve this police community relationships. A lot of the youth that I work with, they don't trust even trying to report to the CCRB because they don't feel it's accessible to them, or they feel that they're not represented there. So some of the conversations that, as we've heard today, how can we improve is the CCRB needs to look like the community so that they have the pulse of the city, they know what's going on in their community, and that they can actually reach out to the community so that they can bring them in and create some legitimacy as to the fact that they actually can be represented at the CCRB effectively. So that's all.
Thank you very much. Ms. Conti-Cook.
Good evening. My name is Cynthia Conti-Cook. I'm an attorney at the Special Litigation Unit of the Legal Aid Society, which is the largest public defender in New York City. We serve all 5 boroughs. We're also a member of Communities United for Police Reform. What I want to talk about tonight are 3 things, and I apologize I don't have written testimony to submit to you today, but I will get it to you. The 3 things that I want to talk about this evening are the conflict between the law department and oversight agencies like the Civilian Complaint Review Board as well as the Board of Correction. Of course, this evening I will focus on the Civilian Complaint Review Board and how that impacts our work in terms of what is publicly disclosed regarding police misconduct information and also what is disclosed throughout the criminal court discovery process. The second thing that I want to talk about is the independence of the CCRB, and the third is the budget transparency. So I want to start in talking about the conflict between the law department and the Civilian Complaint Review Board by discussing a little bit of history. So before I worked at the Legal Aid Society, I was a civil rights attorney and fought for 7.5 years, more than 100 cases of civil rights 1983 federal lawsuit. And the opposing counsel in every single one of those lawsuits was the city law department. In 2014, I moved to the Legal Aid Society and I initiated several FOIL requests. The CCRB in 2014 had answered several of those FOIL requests and had responded with information about a summary of those officers' civilian complaints and whether they were substantiated, unsubstantiated, and what they recommended to the NYPD. Several months later, that process ended, and suddenly we found ourselves in a position where we had to litigate for the Freedom of Information request that we had sent in, and we began litigation, and the opposing counsel in that case was also the city law department. So the city law department was responding not just for the Civilian Complaint Review Board, at the same time it was simultaneously representing all of the officers who have been sued for civil rights violations. It's also representing the NYPD. And that conflict, I think, needs to be addressed by this Charter Revision Commission. One of the other results of that, if we go back to about 2014, 2015, so when the CCRB stopped responding to our FOIL requests and we began litigating against the City of New York for those FOIL requests, at the same time in criminal court, we saw the CCRB, this is not occurring now, this has passed, but for a period of time, and because the law is unclear enough and the charter is unclear enough, for a period of time, the Civilian Complaint Review Board's general counsel was coming into criminal court and fighting every subpoena that we were issuing for police officer misconduct records in cases where it was up to the judge as the gatekeeper to decide whether or not those records were relevant and material in each case. And it is because we even had a case where the judge had ordered that the subpoena be signed and that the CCRB information be turned over, and the CCRB appealed the judge's order. And they eventually withdrew that motion when we intervened, but it was an example of how extreme this conflict can take an agency that is supposed to be an oversight agency and how far it can take it from its mission.
Hold on. Dr. Chaudhary, can I ask you to give the time you didn't use to Ms. Conti-Cook?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll move to the other 2 points. As was mentioned on the earlier panel, the independence of the CCRB is extremely important, especially in their ability to serve officers. What partially caused the delay of the initiation of the disciplinary proceedings against Daniel Pantaleo was the CCRB's inability itself to serve police officers with the charges it wants to bring. The issue about budget transparency, in addition to what's already been mentioned, which of course we support, I want to add that the breakdown in the budget needs to happen also by command. We issued a website yesterday, capstat.nyc, and in that website you can really analyze officers by overtime and commands by overtime. And the budget needs to also allow a breakdown by command so that it's very clear which commands are costing the city the most amount of overtime. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Commissioners? Oh, I'm sorry. No, not commissioners. Mr. Kaur?
Did you give written testimony,
No,
my dear?
she did not. She's going to provide the
I
written
will.
testimony in the ensuing days. Mr. Kaur?
Good evening. Thank you for having me here. I just came down from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I work as the director of our city's Police Review and Advisory Board, our city's oversight agency, and I'm also serving as the president of NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I think it's probably more in that capacity I was asked to come down. NACOL represents approximately 70 civilian oversight agencies of all types across the United States, and about 1,000 individuals who work in civilian oversight as staff, board members, and other capacities. And my own personal background, I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, grew up in an era in the 70s where we saw serious police misconduct, have worked for the ACLU of Massachusetts as an organizer, and have been working in municipal government for about 11 years. The things I want to really focus on in my brief period here is to say that my philosophy around civilian oversight is that ultimately we have the same goal. Police departments, communities as a whole want peaceful and just communities. And where that falls short is often where civilian oversight has been asked to come in. But for civilian oversight to be successful, there are many elements that are important, and I will hopefully get a chance to touch on some of those during the questioning from the commissioners. But I will say that it is vital that procedural justice and legitimacy exist in oversight. Just as we demand that in our policing, we also demand that in oversight. And it means that civilian oversight has to be impartial, it has to be fair, it has to look not just at back-end accountability, looking at what went wrong and what should we do about it, but also at front-end accountability. How do we create systems within policing and within society that promote the type of policing that our communities need and deserve? And so in my comments, I also want to mention that the CCRB is very important, but also the OIG NYPD, the Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD, is a very important element of oversight here in New York City. In civilian oversight, we have to be looking at not just, as I said, what went wrong, but what are the systemic issues? And that's an important part of creating the type of police departments that we need. The other thing I'll mention that I think is very important is the role of trauma. Individual trauma, community trauma, historical trauma. And that trauma exists not just in the broader community or in the most oppressed communities, but also within law enforcement. And if we do not understand the role that trauma plays in interactions between individuals, within the systemic issues, within law enforcement, and in how law enforcement officers themselves experience trauma, we will not make progress in this work. So those are some key points, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, good evening. My name is Nick Mitchell, and I am the independent monitor of the Denver Police and Denver Sheriff Departments. I'm also a New Yorker, and in what feels like probably a lifetime ago, I once worked for the CCRB. I'm an attorney, and I suppose I'm here to talk with you about my experiences in Denver. In these brief opening remarks, I don't have sufficient time to comment on each of the proposed changes that are before you, though I do have some thoughts that I'm happy to discuss during the Q&A portion. So instead, I wanted to propose a framework for you to think about each proposed change. As you contemplate each proposal, I suggest that you frame your inquiry around three principal questions. First, would the proposed change improve the independence and effectiveness of the oversight agency? Second, would the proposed change enhance the public's trust in the independence and effectiveness of the agency? And third, what are the likely unintended consequences associated with making the proposed change? I believe that the answers to these three key questions will help you to determine what changes should ultimately be recommended for the city's charter. I was asked to speak about Denver to help provide some context for your current process. And during my 6-year tenure as the independent monitor in Denver, on 3 occasions, Denver's charter or ordinances have been amended to address problems that have arisen regarding the powers or independence of my office. For example, oversight agencies are sometimes rendered ineffective or less effective than they could be by legal provisions that are ambiguous about the authority of the oversight agency to obtain documents or information from within the police department. In Denver, we had a somewhat ambiguous legal provision that governed my access to information, and perhaps better stated, it was ambiguous about the police and sheriff department's obligations to share documents and information with me upon request. Several years ago, after considerable friction regarding my access to internal documents, the law was changed to ensure that we now have much broader authority to access all documents and information within the departments we oversee, with some limited caveats. And it's my understanding that one of the recurring issues here in New York for the Inspector General and possibly for the CCRB relates to ambiguity about what documents and information must be disclosed by the NYPD. If that is indeed an issue, it would both undermine the effectiveness of the oversight agencies and the public's perception of their effectiveness and should be remedied by a change in the law. Similarly, I note that several of the proposals before you relate to enhancing the independence of the CCRB, and I haven't really yet seen proposals that address the independence of the Inspector General. Many agencies, including some Inspector General agencies, have created structures in which the Inspector General is truly independent and free from any appearance of possible political influence over his or her decision-making. In New York, the Inspector General is an official within the Department of Investigation and is subordinate to several layers of appointees within that agency. That is, although the city has hired an Inspector General and told the public that they will receive that person's unvarnished opinions and analysis about some of the most pressing public safety issues facing the city, that person has been embedded underneath several political appointees within DOI, all of whom could theoretically influence the reports issued by the Inspector General. And I want to be clear, I know I have no time left. I have no cause to believe that any official within DOI would operate with anything other than good faith in the handling of the OIG or attempt to interfere with the IG's reports. But in thinking about the second question that I proposed earlier, the public's perception of independence and effectiveness, this structure in which the IG is subordinate to several layers of political appointees could create doubt for the public about whether or not the IG is truly as independent as has been advertised. And that's an issue that I suggest you should grapple with during this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from commissioners? Let's start with Commissioner Nuri and move in a leftward direction.
Thank you all for taking the time to come out here. Ms. Conti Cook, I too work at the Legal Aid Society. You're one of my heroes. I'm embarrassed to say that we've never met, but it's a big organization. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the new to me, the database that you've been working on and the impact of transparency or the issue of transparency in police misconduct and what that means and other initiatives that would address the lack of transparency within the NYPD.
Yes, thank you. And likewise, I do forget how large 3,000 people, a large organization can feel like. The reason I didn't bring up transparency earlier is because I'm not sure what solution there is within this commission's purview. Civil Rights Law 50A is a state law and is really the crux of the problem. That said, the position that public defenders are in relation to this information, and then I'll move to the public, but the position that public defenders were in when I joined Legal Aid Society in 2014 and began the work of building a database in 2015, which was available to defenders in 2016. The purpose behind that was because our defenders, when they were submitting their motions, under 50A, they have to submit a motion in order to have a judge sign a subpoena. And the things that the attorneys have to describe in the motion is why they believe there's an existence of police misconduct information in the custody of the NYPD or in the custody of the CCRB that would be relevant and material in their clients' cases. Now, without having access to as much as a summary of that information, it is impossible for our attorneys to be able to describe the existence of records they can access, let alone their relevance and materiality to their case. To address that problem of really arguing in the darkness for our clients' ability to confront the people that are accusing them of crimes, we created the database, which allowed our defenders to review the publicly available information that there is about officers' misconduct histories to the extent that it's described in documents external to the custody of the NYPD and external to the custody of the CCRB. And that mostly was lawsuits filed in federal court through 1983 allegations. To some extent, that also included newspaper articles where officers are described as committing misconduct. The way that our defenders have been able to use this database in court is that they've been able to then point to the existence of some information about officers' misconduct, and then use that information to argue that there's likely existence of misconduct records in the custody of the CCRB or the NYPD, and therefore the judge should sign the subpoena. Now, the impact that it has on the public is that people who've been harmed by the people who've been harmed by the police are not able to sort of have any sense of whether that was a bad day for an officer, whether that was a mistake, or whether this is a systemic problem, and whether this is a problem that is not occurring because of an off day or something that they misinterpreted, but because something that this officer has done. And really this work for me began when I was filing civil rights complaints, and I saw the same people coming in to complain about the same squad of officers in the Brooklyn North Narcotics Unit over and over again who were abusing people repeatedly the same way, and yet the new people would come in reporting the same type of misconduct over and over. So people are harmed and unable to know. The public is not able to engage in an informed debate because they are prevented from knowing the context and the amount of information that the debate really requires. So we can't sit here today, for example, and say, you know what, the police department isn't doing a very good job at disciplining stop and frisk, as Mr. Albanese mentioned. We have no idea of what the average penalty is for an unlawful stop or a frisk. And therefore, it's very difficult for the public to walk in and say, we want more penalties for stop and frisk or different types of penalties. So those are some of the ways that the lack of this information. Those are some of the ways that this lack of information harms the people accused of crimes and harms the public.
Reverend Miller? Councilmember Albanese?
Mr. Coy, you discussed the importance of civilian oversight, which I agree with. But in essence, don't we have civilian oversight? We elect the mayor, we elect the city council. Mayor appoints the police commissioner, mayor appoints members to the CCRB, the city council appoints members to the CCRB. And if we don't like what they're doing, we can kick them out in the next election. Isn't that, in essence, civilian oversight?
To answer your question, Commissioner, I would say in the literal sense it is. In a practical sense, for that oversight to be exercised effectively in a city as large as New York, or many cities, even my own city, you need to have an infrastructure that can actually do that work. And it also does need to be independent of the police department. Now, I will say that it's very important that it be part of government. To be able to exercise that oversight effectively, you need entities that also report to the mayor, to the city council, and can balance out that power. But you have to have a structure with people who are trained in civilian oversight, who understand investigations, and who also can look at these systemic issues. But ultimately, I would say that civilian oversight is most effective when you have people who are able to focus on that as part of their work, are able to understand the broader picture of civilian oversight, can look at the history in a specific community and nationally, and can really understand what are the standards, what is the type of training that both law enforcement officers get and civilian oversight practitioners get. Civilian oversight cannot be effectively exercised by an executive individual or even a small cabinet, but it has to be within an agency that has independence, that has sufficient budget, and has the appropriate access. Talking about inspectors general in particular, one of the principles is unfettered access. If you look at the national level, a bedrock principle, and this is quoting the Council of Inspectors General from a May 2016 letter they sent to Senators McConnell and Reid federally, a bedrock principle of the Inspector General Act of 1978 is that an Inspector General must have access to all agency records and information, quote, which relate to programs and operations with respect to which that Inspector General has responsibilities under the Act. So I bring that up because, again, to have effective civilian oversight, you have to have that level of access in an agency that is within the government, but is separate from and devoted to oversight.
But that's up to the political system or the mayor or the city council to create that infrastructure, correct?
That would be my position in terms of something that can be effective in terms of having oversight of the police department.
And you pointed out something very important, that is that you need checks and balances. You need entities that are independent of whatever agency, like the city. You have the city council and the mayor, and they are checks and balances, right? We need the same thing with agencies. The city council, if they did their job properly, would also has oversight over the police department and the public safety committee. So we have these things in place. Now, you mentioned the Inspector General. Ms. Cook referred to the Federal Monitor that I mentioned. They're both outside the police department. In your opinion, is that a good vehicle for the checks and balances that we need? Just your opinion. You know, you're not a New Yorker, I know.
No, I know. But I try to be good anyway. So, no, I would say, in my opinion, it's a vital part. It's not the only thing. And in this particular model, I think the Inspector General within DOI is an interesting model. As Mr. Mitchell mentioned, there are a few layers. I would say a best practice would be for there to be either independence or quasi-independence from DOI. I did a lot of work with the city of Chicago as they were creating a Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety about 2 years ago in the wake of everything they've gone through. And so they did create a DIG, Deputy Inspector General, within the Inspector General's agency in order to be part of that umbrella and to have access, but it's a bit different from the other deputy inspectors general in that agency. The budget and the staffing for the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety was about 1/4 of the entire budget of the IG's office in Chicago. And also that particular position was something that you could not just dismiss the person at will, but there had to be cause, and the council was involved in that. So I think that to have an effective inspector general that really has the independence, because of the size of the police department, because you're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar budget, tens of thousands of sworn law enforcement officers and more civilians, you need to actually make sure that the inspector general in this city, which has oversight of the police department, is able to have the independence and the resources to do that effectively. And then with CCRB, I'll just add that I've reviewed some of the recommendations they've made, and I know that the director will be testifying, so I won't say a lot, but I think the recommendations they're making are important about unfettered access, about the budget being pegged to the police department budget. That really is being seen as a best practice in communities where you can do that, so that whatever happens as the police department grows or shrinks, as you bring in body-worn cameras and video or other things, that the oversight agency has the ability and the budget and the staffing to manage that and to do its oversight effectively. I'll stop with that because I could go on and on.
One more question of Professor Chowdhury.
Yes.
I'm always puzzled by this. You know, we have, you mentioned, and you did an assessment of your students, and they had a very negative view of the police. Correct?
Well, they distrusted.
They distrusted the police. Now, every poll that I've seen over the last 9 to 10 years, the findings were that 70% of the minorities, communities, people of color, held the police and had a favorable view of the police. How do we...
Had a favorable?
A favorable view, yes.
Which poll? I'm sorry. I'm not aware of the poll that you're discussing.
No, there were a number of polls, but I can send them to you, but...
Yeah. I mean, if we look at studies and understand systemic trauma and the relationship between black and brown communities and the police, we know there's a historical kind of layer, right, of what has gone and the distrust and where it comes from, right? We are not far from that. I mean, I don't have to bring out the cases, right? Michael Brown, Eric Garner. Right here in New York City, we have a lot, right? I've seen videos of young people walking home from school. I work with kids that walk home from school and are sometimes, you know, kind of ostracized by the police, not for doing anything, just maybe not saying hi or not looking approachable, whatever it is, right? I work in the community, like I'm with the kids, right? And for me, it's problematic when I teach criminal justice. And I used to be a law enforcement officer for 10 years. I used to be a probation officer for the state of New Jersey. I know how important it is to have a good relationship with the community so that the young people we work with trust us, right? So we need transparency. We need oversight. We need the Civilian Review Board to actually look like the community. Because right now, the way it looks, it's not accessible to them. They don't feel comfortable reporting complaints and things like that. So I'm not sure of the polls that you're referring to, but I know there are several studies. You can look at Victor Rios' Policing Black and Brown Lives. He has a huge ethnography talk about Oakland. We could look at New York City's history. We just have, right now, you already know we're under, all of this is coming out because people are dissatisfied. And my concern is, as a professor who teaches criminal justice, I'm teaching future officers. I worry about their safety, right? Because when they're delegitimized, when they're working out in the community, because there's no trust in them right now, how can they do a good job, even for the ones that are out there trying to do a good job, right? And then for the community, because I'm worried about these kids that don't feel comfortable reporting to the police, and so they're walking around carrying guns because they don't feel safe. Let's be real, so, I just think that, growing up in a black and brown community, growing up in a predominantly working class community, I have a different worldview. And, as far as my research is concerned, for the populations that I usually work with are young people that are in gangs and, young people that live in these type of communities. I work right now in Harlem with the Living Redemption Youth Opportunity Hub. And and I do a lot of work in Paterson, New Jersey, so I know, what these kids fear, right? And I would love for them to feel safe in their community. And one of the ways to do it is legitimizing it by having transparency with the CCRB that's representative of them, and they feel that it is accessible to them. So that's just my take on it.
Council, jazz hands. Councilmember Fiala.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of the panelists for those of you who traveled from outside of New York. We thank you for visiting us, and we thank all of you for attending tonight. You know, Professor, I would say you're very eloquent, and the issue of trust, I don't think is lost on anybody today, because it seems to me that your colleagues in the university or college setting, regardless of what area they teach, let's take law enforcement out of the mix, right? You go into any other profession, and I imagine the students would say the same thing about that area of vocation, because it seems that over the last half century, our trust as a people in institutions, government, religious, and otherwise, has been on a downward trend. So trust is very important. I agree with you there. But that's a tough concept, right? In the abstract, it's easy. When you then try to get into the specifics of, okay, what does that mean? So my questions, if I could start with Mr. Mitchell, you used the word independence a few times. Independence is a great word. We all like to think we're more independent. We all kind of support the notion of independence. It's a bold word. For most people, I think they perceive it as a good thing. But what does it truly look like? Right? How do you go from that abstract notion of an independent external review board for policing? How do you go from the abstract to the specific? What, in your view, constitutes true independence? And if you could, to the extent you can, specifically with regards to New York City, what's lacking right now that if these things were addressed would suddenly equate to, okay, now we have true independence of this external review board?
So thank you for that question. I guess my first point would be, I don't know that there's one thing lacking. You know, in light of the testimony that has already been provided tonight, I think there are probably several areas that are lacking that may be necessary to create the kind of independence that people in the city appear to be calling for. When I use the word independent, I was speaking specifically about the Inspector General and the structure in which that official is subordinate to several layers of other sort of political appointees, and that seems to me to be a relatively obvious potential independence problem in light of the somewhat politically charged nature of the work and of the reporting being done by necessity by an Inspector General's office of the NYPD. So I think there, when I use the word independent, I was referencing the IG's office in particular. There probably are a number of steps that could be taken to enhance both the actual independence of the CCRB as well as the public's perception of its independence. I think you've heard some of those tonight, and I don't know if we have time to go through all of them. I certainly sympathize with the democratic kind of impulse that we've heard about in terms of an elected CCRB, though I have some potential reservations about the unintended consequences associated with having an elected board. But I do believe that steps need to be taken to enhance the public's perception of the independence of that body.
So could I ask each of you your thoughts on an elected? You have some concerns with unintended consequences. Mr. Kaur, I don't know if I caught you agreeing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, right? We know what is intended, right? We don't ever spend enough time on what are the unintended consequences, what other types of things could result. So if any of you feel comfortable enough that you want to approach this question, I'd be grateful.
Well, I'd be happy to start off. And I think that, yes, unintended consequences are very important. I will say I'm not an attorney, so I don't necessarily have that worst case scenario thinking that is very valuable in an attorney, perhaps. But I do think specifically when we're thinking about civilian oversight and unintended consequences, I would put those in two broad categories, considering the proposals I'm aware of that have been made, and with no disrespect to people who are here in New York City who are doing this work and who are living the struggle. I would say that the main challenge I see around an elected civilian review board is that once you have a group of people that are elected that have oversight of the police department, there will be many, many forces locally and nationally. You've got, I believe, 4 very powerful police unions. You've got a National Federation of Police. There will be lots and lots of effort to make those elections turn out the way that those forces want. And as someone who personally comes out of a lefty political organizing background, and that's really where my heart is, I also have learned that the belief often in the community is we're better organizers and that we'll out-organize the opposition. And I think the biggest unintended consequence of having an elected civilian review board would be that it would become political. Again, not to disparage anyone or pick on anyone, but I know I heard a comment earlier about it shouldn't be politicians who are doing this. Well, if you have an elected review board, it is by its very nature political, and they are politicians. And I'm not opposed to politicians. The other big unintended consequence that I see from some of the proposals that have been made is actually around binding recommendations. And I wouldn't say that I or NACOL has an absolute position on this, but one of the challenges when you have something where you have binding recommendations that are outside of the command structure is you've got people who are managed within that paramilitary policing structure, but the discipline is separate. And again, in the abstract, that could sound really great, but the reality is there are many unintended consequences, and it's sort of, when you squeeze the balloon, it pops out someplace else. So I think people have to be very careful as they're contemplating what would be the actual results of, say, giving the OIG NYPD or the CCRB absolutely binding power on specific recommendations about misconduct or on broader recommendations about systemic changes. I'll stop with that.
Reverend Miller?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think Commissioner Fiala brings up a very interesting dynamic that might give us traction on how to resolve some of these issues regarding trust. How do you transform the abstract to the specific? How do you make this look like something we can all understand and practice? In my conversations with police officers and high-ranking brass, there's an unspoken pedigree requirement. So that ends up looking like a police officer's father was a police officer and grandfather was a police officer. And there is a very inherent distrust for people of color not to become police officers. Have there been any studies done? And Mr. Kaur, you mentioned not only working on the back end of police misconduct, but working on the front end or being proactive. Have there been any studies that could try to translate how hiring could become easier with the result of the police force being reflective of the population in the 5 boroughs, more so than it is right now?
So I'll use this opportunity to first say I'm not an academic and I don't have studies that I can cite, so I will try to respond to the heart of your question. In terms of reflecting communities, I'm going to say something I want everyone to really think about. We often hear, rightfully so, that we want our police departments to look like our communities. We think about where people live, we think about what their ethnicity is, we think about their family background, which is very important. I rarely hear anyone say, and we want police departments that are 50% female. I think the biggest thing we can do to change policing in this country is to have a balance between overall, understanding gender is changing in our society, men and women, and have much more of a balance. Not because women are inherently different from men, but the socialization that men and women undergo is different. The standards that we hold women and men to are different. And if we want to change policing, if we want to reduce the use of force, whether it's found lawful or not. We should change that aspect of policing. The other thing I will say related to this is that when you talk about multi-generational police families and a lack of trust that police may have of people who don't have that background experience, this is where I go back to trauma. There's a different but shared experience of trauma. And I think people in law enforcement are becoming increasingly aware of this. They're looking at the role that trauma plays around bad decision making, around shortened life expectancies, and increasingly understanding why police officers and police systems make bad, terrible decisions that take people's lives needlessly. Not just law enforcement officers' lives, of course, but the lives of people all over this country, especially black and brown people and young people. And at the same time, we have to look at how trauma has affected our communities. And officers have to understand that. They have to understand the history. So I would say those are my big two buckets, so not really directly answering your question, but we have to look at the gender composition of our police departments and change that radically. And we also have to look at the role of individual and multi-generational trauma and how that sets up this terrible cycle of violence, of mistrust from I hate to say both sides because that's a toxic term these days in our society, but from these different parts of our community, the police department, law enforcement, the community activists, the everyday residents, the government officials, all of us have to be taken out of that cycle of trauma and violence.
Mr. Karras?
Just if you could all perhaps, I want to thank everyone. I think this is great. The police commissioner, we haven't said anything about the police commissioner. In New York City, appointed solely by the mayor, only can be removed by the mayor or the governor under some circumstances. Should that change?
Should it change in what respect?
Should there be somebody, should the police commissioner be accountable to more than just the mayor? Should there be advice and consent? Should there be a term? Well, there is a term, a 5-year term, but I think the council has proposed a 3-year term where they have to come back to the council in 3 years, and therefore, if their rate of ignoring the CCRB discipline is 95%, they'd have to answer that after 3 years. I'm just asking for your thoughts on that. It's sort of the other end of the equation.
Sure. Well, I think your question sort of relates back to the question about political accountability earlier from the commission. And yes, clearly the sort of political oversight of the police department is an important component. It's not the same thing, as I think Mr. Kaur mentioned, it's not the same thing as civilian oversight. It's political oversight by the political branches, and it is sort of, policing is a critical municipal function that I think sort of belongs with the mayor's office, but the city council has a very important role to play in overseeing the way in which the policing function is executed in the city of New York, and that would and should include tough questions about things like some of the statistics that we heard on the first panel about the rate at which the police commissioner is or is not accepting the CCRB's findings for discipline. It could and should include very tough political oversight from the city council associated with a whole variety of functions of the police department and how they're being carried out. Whether that equates to changes, in the advice and consent process, that seems like it would make sense to me. I'm not sort of taking a position on behalf of my agency, but from my personal perspective, I think it would make sense to involve the city council at both sort of the front end in the appointment process and on, the back end in overseeing the performance of the commissioner, and so I would support those kinds of proposals.
That's not mine. Ms. Conti Cook, I had a couple of questions. Okay, I had a couple of questions for you. You spoke about the law department and their role in representing, perhaps you would say, too many clients at the same time and wearing too many hats. within the process of police accountability and discipline. Could you elaborate on how you think that could be handled in a better way, and whether you think there's a need for some other type of legal representation within that system?
Yes, and thank you. I did not get to sort of close that loop and offer what I think could be the recommendation. And the recommendation would be to allow the Civilian Complaint Review Board and other types of oversight agencies to elect conflict counsel, or to have conflict counsel, where they could ask for legal advice or legal representation from law firms outside the law department of the city of New York. And so both of the things that are happening, where the CCRB is interpreting 50A along the lines of the city law department and is interpreting its disclosure duties under subpoenas, I think both of those legal interpretations were made directly because the law department was sort of dictating how they interpreted Civil Rights Law 50A.
And my second question, it has to do with something the prior panel brought up, which is that, and this is for you and the other members, that there are other officers who are not represented under CCRB, such as peace officers, school safety officers. Do you know of any example where officers other than police officers are disciplined for those officers are handled through a CCRB type process?
In another jurisdiction?
Yes.
I'm not aware, no.
So in Denver, Colorado, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the independent monitor of the Denver Police Department and the Denver Sheriff Department. The Sheriff Department in Denver does not have a patrol function, so it does not patrol, its officers do not patrol the streets. They run the jails, they run courthouse security, they run the vehicle impound lots and other kind of associated processes. And so through my office, we oversee the investigation of both police officers and, in effect, sheriff deputies who are really quasi kind of correction officers.
And do they also handle the discipline of other police personnel, such as 911 operators or?
We do not. Our jurisdiction is limited to sworn employees of the police department and the sheriff department. For civilian employees, there's a separate process handled by the departments for investigating and disciplining civilian employees.
And if I may, there are so many different models. Every place is different. But I know, for example, Milwaukee, they have a police and fire commission. And so in Milwaukee, you have one agency that has oversight both of the police and of the fire department. And it may not occur to a lot of people, but they actually get lots of complaints about people in the fire department. And again, thinking about what firefighters go through and the trauma they experience and how they may act inappropriately, you can imagine there are a number of issues that come up. So, and that's something that, we could certainly at NACOL, I could go back and talk with my colleagues around the country and find out which agencies have that kind of multi-jurisdictional oversight.
I'd be really interested in anything you could supply us with. That came up from a prior panel, and it had never occurred to me and was not aware of the discrepancies. But thank you very much. Are there other questions for this panel?
Can I just say something?
Yes.
I want to say that I learned so much listening to all of you tonight, the first panel and the second panel. I learned a lot, and it made me think about things in a very different way. And I want to thank all of you for taking your time.
Are there any other questions for this panel? If not, I thank you very much, and I hope we'll be in touch with you in the days to come. Thank you very much.
I left my cards in my I'm sorry. I can write down. Yes, I Yes.
No, but still that I think that's a good. I agree. I think doing it all would be, I think, biting off more than anyone can chew.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, my name is Sean. Yeah, that's
The system can grind to a halt. Thanks.
Just say that we'll take like 5 minutes. Where do you live? Okay, so I live in Somerville. Yeah, in the 20th century. So. Why do you go to
Oh, when I was like, what's the context? Like, I was like, I don't get it.
You were like, okay, I guess it's a theoretical issue, but what's the practical problem that you're trying to solve? And I was like, yes. I forget what it was.
Oh, there. I can't remember. What was that? Like, redistricting. Like, I've never heard, I've always heard that we do, like, good redistricting, that our redistricting is pretty good.
Yeah.
So, like, what are we trying to get at?
I get it's a problem that in theory,
Like, I was like, what, could you give me an example of a district that was ever drawn so politically that, like, people were horrible?
And I was like,
I mean, we hear, like, about these districts in North Carolina that are shaped like this. It's like, where is that here?
I appreciate that. It's funny, the movement in town, they're not staying for I thought they'd be able to.
They should. They should.
Yeah.
Indiana, can you get Bianca for me? Can you get Bianca for me?
Okay, I'm here.
Can you get Bianca for me for a second?
Oops, sorry. Okay.
What's going on? Madam, how are you? They're not going to leave until you gamble back in. Just stay there and take a picture. Well, no, the upstairs people have left.
Oops.
I'd say give it a couple of wraps and then tell people if you could start finding your seats. We're good for the next panel to go. The final panel.
Excuse me, we have one more panel to go, folks. So if you could start finding your seats. And for our final panel, we'll be joined by Deputy Commissioner Kevin Richardson and Oleg Chernyavsky. How badly did I mangle it? As well as Jonathan Darsh, or Darshay.
Darsh.
From CCRB. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves and share any comments that you may have. Let us start with Mr. Darsh.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You need to turn your mic on when the red dot is on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jonathan Darsh, and I'm the Executive Director of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, or CCRB, an independent city agency that investigates, prosecutes, and mediates complaints of misconduct filed by civilians against the New York City Police Department. Against members of the New York City Police Department. Thank you to the 2019 Charter Revision Commission for inviting me to speak about some of the proposed city charter changes related to police accountability. The CCRB is committed to a fair, transparent, and robust system of police accountability in New York. However, there are a number of challenges to achieving that goal that would be greatly diminished by making 4 changes to the city charter. First, to codify the CCRB's Administrative Prosecution Unit. Second, to enable the board to designate the power to sign subpoenas to the agency's highest-ranking staff. Third, to better define the department's duty to cooperate with the agency with our request for information and documents related to policy, outreach, and operational support. And finally, to amend the CCRB budget to be 1% of the NYPD's budget. I can provide more detail on any of our recommendations, achievable charter revisions that we think would help strengthen the CCRB, but for tonight, I'll limit my focus to 2 important areas: codification of the APU and the NYPD's duty to cooperate. The work of the APU is governed by a 2012 Memorandum of Understanding between the NYPD and CCRB, the first unit of its kind in the United States
and heralded as a significant step for police oversight by local elected officials and advocates. The APU prosecutes nearly all the cases in which the board recommends charges and specifications, the most serious disciplinary recommendation. Since the creation of the APU, the CCRB has administratively prosecuted officers for misconduct at 374 trials. As evidenced by the APU's current prosecution in the Pantaleo case, the APU is a vital part of the disciplinary process for officers who commit misconduct. Amending the city charter to codify the APU will ensure that this independent and effective tool for civilian oversight will continue. Similarly, better defining the NYPD's duty to cooperate would enable the established cooperation between agencies to continue, regardless of leadership changes at either agency. The charter currently requires that the NYPD cooperate with CCRB investigations, but lacks any specific language requiring the department to cooperate with prosecutions or the agency's operational capabilities. Further, while there is no current charter requirement for the police commissioner to defer to the CCRB's findings of fact or recommendations for discipline, there is also no requirement for the commissioner to explain his or her reasons when downwardly departing. Madam Chair, do you mind if I finish?
No, please.
Thank you, ma'am. When downwardly departing from the CCRB's findings and recommendations, including a provision in the charter to require the police commissioner to document the CCRB the case-specific factual and legal reasoning for downward departures would help hold the police commissioner accountable for disciplinary decisions regardless of the person in the role. That's it, ma'am.
That's all?
Yes, ma'am.
You sure?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm giving you an extra minute, so you can take it if you want.
I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions from the Commission.
Mr. Chern, you said it.
Sure. I may have to take that extra minute, so I hope that's
If he'll
okay.
give it, well, he doesn't actually have it.
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. I am Oleg Chernovsky, Executive Director of the Legislative Affairs Unit of the NYPD. I'm joined here today by Deputy Commissioner and Department Advocate Kevin Richardson. On behalf of Police Commissioner O'Neill, I'm pleased to offer comment on our internal discipline process and our shared goals of increasing transparency into this process. While I've submitted a lengthier statement in the interest of time, I'd like to highlight recent action the Police Commissioner has taken to improve the department's discipline process and our push for greater transparency into the process before speaking to some of the charter revision proposals. As part of his continuing effort to better the department, Commissioner O'Neill last year took the unprecedented step of commissioning an external panel of criminal justice experts to examine the department's internal discipline process. Though the panel noted that there was no evidence of a lack of fairness, it made a number of important recommendations which the Commissioner immediately accepted. He quickly formed an implementation group chaired by the First Deputy Commissioner and a number of the department executives to guide the effective implementation of these recommendations, some of which the department was already in the process of addressing. For example, taking steps to expedite the disciplinary timeline and assessing the feasibility of adopting a disciplinary matrix to assist in the consistent application of discipline. Equally important with regard to transparency, the department strongly supports legislative efforts to amend rather than repeal Civil Rights Law 50A. Our goal for an amended 50A would permit us to release information of significant public interest, including officer names, trial transcripts, trial decisions, and final disciplinary outcomes concerning all serious misconduct that leads to the formal service of charges, as well as cases involving improper use of force or improper searches, even if charges are not served in those cases at the conclusion of a disciplinary process. This is information advocates, elected leaders, and the public have long sought. Importantly, such an amendment would leave in place safeguards that protect police officers by allowing the department to assess and address threats to officers' safety prior to disclosing such records. Safeguards against disclosure of non-disciplinary personnel records, such as records dealing with changes to social status, absence from or tardiness at work, and transfer requests. And safeguards aimed at protecting officers against harassment on the stand, reprisals, hostility, and outright threats to their physical safety, which has always been the intent of the law. We pledge to continue those efforts as their fruits will enable us to publicly demonstrate the effectiveness of our discipline process and build greater trust and confidence in the department. I'd now like to briefly comment on some of the charter revision proposals. First, granting the CCRB prosecutorial powers and making their decisions binding. As you're aware, the department and the CCRB are participants in an agreement whereby the police commissioner has delegated CCRB's administrative prosecution unit the authority to prosecute civilian complaints against NYPD officers that have been substantiated and for which the board has recommended charges and specifications. This agreement has been in effect since 2012 and stands as an excellent example of the effective collaboration, cooperation, and respect amongst our agencies. Although the Commissioner can delegate portions of the discipline process, as the legally vested administrator of the department and its discipline, this delegation should not be codified or circumscribed, as it effectively dilutes the Police Commissioner's authority by extinguishing his judgment in this vital area of department governance. Judgment that has been exercised prudently by this Commissioner and his predecessors, who have reflected on their decades of police service to arrive at meaningful and fair discipline that creates a deterrent to future misconduct while at the same time preserving morale. Second, granting subpoena signing power to the CCRB's highest ranking staff. Currently, the CCRB's board may compel attendance of witnesses or production of documents by a majority vote via their existing subpoena power. It is important to note that the department routinely cooperates with the CCRB by providing witnesses and documents without the need for a subpoena. The department does not have an objection to the subpoena signatory authority being expanded to include the executive director of the CCRB in connection with cases where there is an active CCRB investigation based on a civilian complaint. However, we would object to such an expansion, which effectively eliminates the majority board vote safeguard against overly broad demands and demands for information that may not be relevant if the scope of CCRB's authority is expanded beyond its current charge. Third, the expansion of the department's duty to cooperate with CCRB in relation to subjects that go beyond the scope of the investigations. Currently, the charter mandates the department cooperate with the CCRB in connection with investigations that the CCRB is conducting pursuant to its legal authority. While the department will continue to encourage a healthy working relationship that goes beyond the strict bounds of the charter, as we did with the creation of the APU, we do not support such an expansion of the CCRB's authority. As the members of the Commission are aware, the department is the subject of multiple oversight entities to include the Office of the Inspector General, Department of Investigation, District Attorneys, U.S. Attorneys, a federal monitor, the Commission to Combat Police Corruption, the City Council, and of course the public. Allowing an expansion of the CCRB's legal jurisdiction to include prosecution and policy review would be duplicative of existing oversight frameworks and create a significant unfunded burden to the department.
Could you just summarize your last 2 points?
Sure. I have two more. Right. Mandate that the CCRB's budget be fixed, a fixed percentage of the NYPD's budget. It's our position that every city agency has a duty to put forward the justifications for their expenditures and their future needs, and those are the needs that should be evaluated. Tying an agency's